The summer of 1988 started like any other in Philadelphia's quiet northeast neighborhood. Children rode bikes down tree-lined streets. Neighbors chatted across fences, and parents watched from porches as laughter filled the warm air. But on July 12th, that sense of security was shattered forever when a plastic blue bassinet was discovered on the sidewalk, containing the battered body of a 4-year-old girl. Barbara Jean Horn, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and full of life just hours earlier, had been beaten to death, stuffed into a cardboard TV box, and discarded like trash just blocks from her home. Her killer walked free for years while an innocent man spent 2 decades behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. This wasn't just a murder. It was the beginning of a 33-year nightmare that would consume multiple lives and leave a community forever questioning. Who really killed little Barbara Jean? It was Tuesday, July 12, 1988. A sweltering summer day in Philadelphia. Barbara Jean Horn, a vibrant 4-year-old girl with blonde hair and sparkling blue eyes, was playing in the yard of her home on Rutland Street in the northeast section of the city. Her stepfather, John Fahey, was inside working on a car stereo while her mother, Sharon, was at work. At approximately 4 p.m., John Fahey realized something was terribly wrong. Barbara Jean, who had been playing just outside, was nowhere to be found. He began searching the neighborhood, calling her name, checking with neighbors. Within an hour, panic had set in, and police were alerted to the disappearance of the little girl. But by then, it was already too late. Just a few blocks away, on St. Vincent Street, a local resident named Charles Childress was returning home when he spotted something unusual on the curb. A cardboard television box with a plastic blue bassinet on top. Initially thinking someone had left trash on the curb, Childress approached the box. What he discovered inside would haunt the neighborhood for decades. The small, battered body of Barbara Jean Horn had been stuffed into the box. She had been beaten severely, her head showing signs of blunt force trauma. The medical examiner would later determine that she died from these injuries, multiple devastating blows to her head. The community was shell-shocked. How could such a horrific crime occur in broad daylight in a neighborhood where children regularly played outside unattended? They collected evidence from the crime scene, though much of it would later prove to be contaminated or mishandled. The cardboard television box became a central piece of evidence. Detectives tried to trace its origin, believing it might lead them to the killer. For 4 long years, the case remained officially unsolved, though detectives continued to work it. The memory of Barbara Jean faded from headlines, but not from the minds of those tasked with finding her killer or from the nightmares of her family. Then, in 1992, investigators turned their attention to Walter Ogrod, a 27-year-old man who lived across the street from the Horn family at the time of the murder. Ogrod had never been a suspect during the original investigation, despite his proximity to the crime. He had no criminal record for violence and no known connection to Barbara Jean beyond being a neighbor. What led police to Ogrod remains controversial. Some reports suggest that investigators, desperate for a break in the case, began re-interviewing neighbors and developed a new theory focusing on Ogrod. Others believe that detectives, having exhausted other leads, simply decided to pressure a vulnerable individual into a confession. Hey true crime sleuths! If you're finding this case as disturbing and compelling as I do, take a second to hit that subscribe button. It helps me continue bringing these important stories to light, and you'll never miss an update on cases like Barbara Jean's that still cry out for justice. Now, let's dive deeper into this troubling investigation. Walter Ogrod was not a typical suspect. Those who knew him described him as childlike, socially awkward, and with significant developmental disabilities. He had the mental and emotional capacity of someone much younger than his physical age. Some estimates put his mental age as low as 5 years old. He struggled with social interactions and lived a relatively isolated life. When detectives brought Ogrod in for questioning, they subjected him to an interrogation that would last nearly 14 hours. During this marathon session, Ogrod was kept isolated, without access to legal representation. He was sleep-deprived, confused, and vulnerable to the sophisticated psychological tactics employed by experienced homicide detectives. The interrogation techniques used were controversial. Detectives employed the Reid technique, a method known for its psychological pressure and that has been linked to false confessions, particularly from vulnerable individuals. They told Ogrod they had evidence linking him to the crime. They didn't. They suggested that confessing would bring him relief and potentially a more lenient sentence. They presented scenarios of how the crime might have happened, asking Ogrod to simply agree or disagree. After 14 grueling hours, detectives claimed that Ogrod suddenly confessed to luring Barbara Jean into his basement, attempting to sexually assault her, and then striking her with a metal bar when she tried to scream. According to the detectives, Ogrod then agreed to sign a written confession that they prepared. This confession, however, contained numerous inconsistencies with the known facts of the case. Most glaringly, it described Barbara Jean being hit with a metal weight bar, yet the medical examiner had determined she had been beaten with a much lighter object that caused different types of wounds than a metal bar would create. Additionally, the confession included specific details about the crime scene that weren't publicly known, details that critics later suggested could only have been provided by the detectives themselves. The physical evidence never supported this confession. Forensic teams found no blood in Ogrod's basement, no DNA linking him to Barbara Jean, and the metal bar mentioned in the confession was never found. None of Barbara Jean's hair, fibers, or other biological material was found in Ogrod's home. The cardboard TV box couldn't be linked to him. Despite these glaring issues, prosecutors moved forward with charges against Walter Ogrod. They had their confession often considered the gold standard of evidence, and they had a theory of the crime that they believed would convince a jury. Ogrod's first trial began in 1993. His defense team tried to present evidence about his developmental disabilities and the questionable circumstances of his confession, but much of this was limited by the judge. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the confession and the testimony of the detectives who obtained it. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury began deliberations. For 13 hours, they discussed the evidence or lack thereof. As they prepared to deliver their verdict, something extraordinary happened. Just as the jury foreman was about to speak, one juror suddenly stood up and shouted, "He's not guilty." The courtroom erupted in chaos, and the judge was forced to declare a mistrial. This dramatic turn of events should have been a warning sign about the weakness of the case against Ogrod. Instead, prosecutors regrouped and prepared for a second trial. This time, they had new evidence, the testimony of jailhouse informants who claimed Ogrod had confessed to them while in custody. The main jailhouse informant was John Hall, nicknamed the Monsignor for his habit of extracting confessions from fellow inmates. Hall was a notorious snitch who had testified in multiple murder cases. He claimed that Ogrod had provided him with detailed information about Barbara Jean's murder. Another informant, Jay Wolchinski, made similar claims. In 1996, Walter Ogrod went on trial again. This time, the prosecution relied heavily on the testimony of Hall and Wolchinski along with the disputed confession. The defense tried to highlight the complete lack of physical evidence connecting Ogrod to the crime, the coercive nature of his interrogation, and the dubious reliability of jailhouse informants who received benefits for their testimony. Nevertheless, Ogrod was convicted and sentenced to death. For the next 23 years, Walter Ogrod sat on Pennsylvania's death row maintaining his innocence. As the years passed, serious questions about his conviction began to mount. Journalists, particularly Thomas Lowenstein, who wrote the book The Trials of Walter Ogrod, investigated the case and uncovered troubling inconsistencies and misconduct. In 2018, the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office established a conviction integrity unit to review potentially wrongful convictions. Under District Attorney Larry Krasner, this unit began examining Ogrod's case. What they found was disturbing evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and police coercion. But the exoneration of Walter Ogrod, while correcting one terrible injustice, highlighted another. Barbara Jean Horn's real killer has never been identified or brought to justice. New investigations have suggested that Barbara Jean's murder may be linked to other child killings in the Philadelphia area during the same time period. The case bears similarities to the 1984 rape and murder of 5-year-old Carla Villagomez in the Kensington neighborhood, less than 3 miles from where Barbara Jean was killed. In both cases, a young girl was abducted near her home, sexually assaulted, and killed. Both bodies were discarded in a seemingly callous manner. Investigators now believe that Barbara Jean may have been the victim of a serial predator who was active in the Philadelphia area during the 1980s. DNA evidence preserved from Barbara Jean's case is being re-examined using modern techniques that weren't available at the time of her murder. Genetic genealogy, which has helped solve numerous cold cases in recent years, offers some hope that her killer might still be identified. Sharon Fahey, Barbara Jean's mother, has experienced the unique agony of believing justice had been served, only to learn decades later that her daughter's real killer was never caught. For years, she had attended Ogrod's hearings and looked him in the eye, believing he was responsible for her daughter's death. When evidence of his innocence emerged, she showed remarkable grace and publicly apologized to him for the years he lost. "I am sorry that the wrong person was convicted for my daughter's murder," she stated. "My daughter's memory has been tarnished by this wrong conviction. Barbara Jean deserves to have justice served on her behalf." Today, Barbara Jean would have been 39 years old. She might have had children of her own, a career, a life full of the potential that was violently taken from her on that summer day in 1988. Instead, she remains forever 4 years old in the memories of those who loved her and in the minds of investigators who continue to seek her killer. The case of Barbara Jean Horn stands as a stark reminder of the cascading tragedies that can result from a rush to judgment, coerced confessions, and prosecutorial tunnel vision. It represents both the failure of the justice system to protect the innocent and its failure to truly serve victims by finding the actual perpetrators of violent crimes. As for Walter Ogrod, he has struggled to rebuild his life after nearly 3 decades of wrongful imprisonment. He has had to adapt to a world that changed dramatically during his incarceration, a world with cell phones, the internet, and social media that barely existed when he was first arrested. He has received some compensation for his wrongful conviction, though no amount of money can restore the years taken from him. The true killer of Barbara Jean Horn has never been identified or brought to justice. Her case remains officially unsolved, a haunting reminder that while an innocent man lost 28 years of his life, a child killer may still walk free. As we transition to our next case, imagine walking into a small-town church on a quiet Sunday morning. The wooden pews sit empty, waiting for congregants who will never arrive. A Bible rests open on the pulpit, and behind the altar lies the body of Pastor Carol Daniels, staged in a crucifix position, naked, her hair singed, and her throat cut so deeply she was nearly decapitated. The brutal murder of this beloved minister wouldn't just shock the sleepy town of Anadarko, Oklahoma, it would become one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in the state's history. On August 23, 2009, in the small town of Anadarko, Oklahoma, 61-year-old Pastor Carol Daniels arrived at Christ Holy Sanctified Church for Sunday services. The church, a small, white-painted building on a quiet street, had dwindling attendance, but Daniels faithfully drove 60 miles from her home in Oklahoma City each week to keep the doors open for any parishioners who might come. Anadarko, a town of just under 7,000 residents located in Caddo County, was known primarily for its Native American heritage and as the Indian capital of the nation. It was home to the headquarters of several tribal nations, including the Apache, Wichita, and Delaware tribes. The town had its share of economic challenges and social issues, but violent crime, particularly of the magnitude that was about to occur, was rare. Carol Daniels herself was remarkable. At 61, she was not only a pastor but also a mother and grandmother who had dedicated her life to service. She worked for the Oklahoma Department of Human Services in Oklahoma City, helping families in need. Despite the long drive and dwindling congregation at Christ Holy Sanctified Church, she remained committed to her calling, believing that maintaining a spiritual presence in Anadarko was important. That Sunday morning began like any other. Daniels made the hour-long drive from her home in Oklahoma City to Anadarko. She arrived at the small church, unlocked the doors, and prepared for services. She likely arranged her materials at the pulpit, perhaps reviewed her sermon notes, and waited for congregants to arrive. But no one came. By noon, the church remained empty. A concerned citizen passing by noticed that while the church doors were open, there appeared to be no activity inside. Worried about Pastor Daniels, this individual called the police to check on her welfare. When officers arrived at Christ Holy Sanctified Church, they discovered a scene so horrific that many of the first responders would require counseling afterward. Even in the annals of murder investigations, what they found was described as exceptionally disturbing. Carol Daniels' body was discovered behind the altar. She had been brutally murdered and posed in a crucifix position, arms outstretched, with her hair and clothing arranged with chilling precision. The killer had staged her naked body, placing her clerical robe and undergarments nearby. Her throat had been cut so deeply that she was nearly decapitated, and portions of her hair appeared to have been burned or singed. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, OSBI, was immediately called in to assist the Anadarko Police Department. The crime scene was so disturbing that authorities initially sealed all records related to the case, an unusual step that underscored the extreme nature of the murder. Most disturbing to investigators was the ritualistic nature of the crime scene. It appeared that the killer had not only murdered Daniels but had taken time to arrange her body in a deliberate, symbolic manner. This suggested either a deeply disturbed individual with a personal connection to religion or someone attempting to create the impression of a ritualistic killing to confuse investigators. Adding to the mystery, investigators discovered that the crime scene had been cleaned. Bleach and other cleaning products had been used in an apparent attempt to remove evidence, indicating a level of premeditation and awareness of forensic techniques that concerned authorities. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. It was methodical, planned, and executed with a disturbing level of care. The brutality of the murder sent shockwaves through the small community of Anadarko. Churches across the town held vigils and prayer services for Pastor Daniels. The community, already grappling with economic challenges and social issues, now faced the terrifying prospect that a killer of extraordinary violence and calculation was potentially among them. If you're finding this case analysis valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me continue uncovering the truth behind these tragic unsolved cases. Plus, you'll be the first to know when new details emerge in either of these heartbreaking investigations. Now, let's continue examining the puzzling evidence in Carol Daniels' case. The investigation quickly revealed troubling complications. The crime scene had been extensively cleaned with bleach, potentially destroying crucial DNA evidence that might have identified the killer. Despite this, investigators collected hundreds of pieces of evidence and conducted numerous interviews with local residents. They established a tip line and offered a substantial reward for information leading to an arrest. Jessica Brown, a spokesperson for the OSBI, stated at the time, "This is one of the most horrific crime scenes I've ever seen. I've been with OSBI for 15 years and have worked many homicides, but this rivals any homicide I've ever worked." The details of the crime scene were so disturbing that authorities took the unusual step of sealing the autopsy report and crime scene photographs. Even today, many specifics about the murder remain confidential to protect the integrity of the ongoing investigation and out of respect for Daniels' family. Several theories emerged about the killer's identity and motive. One theory suggested that Daniels might have been targeted by someone with a grudge against her or the church. Investigators looked into her background and professional relationships, examining whether someone from her work at the Department of Human Services might have harbored resentment. However, by all accounts, she was well respected and had no known enemies. Another theory pointed to a possible serial killer, as the ritualistic nature of the crime suggested someone with psychological disturbances who might have committed similar crimes. Investigators checked for comparable cases in the region but found no definitive pattern matching the unique aspects of Daniels' murder. Some speculated that the murder could have been racially motivated. Anadarko has a complex racial history with tensions between its white, Native American, and black communities. Daniels, an African-American woman, was killed in a town where historical racial tensions existed, and her church was the only predominantly black church in the area. However, no concrete evidence of a hate crime has ever been publicly presented. Others wondered if the crime was committed by someone under the influence of drugs or experiencing a psychotic episode, given the extreme brutality and bizarre staging of the body. The methodical cleaning of the crime scene, however, suggested a level of awareness that seemed inconsistent with someone in a drug-induced or psychotic state. There was also speculation about whether the killer might have been someone with inside knowledge of the church's schedule and Pastor Daniels' routine. The fact that she was alone at the time of the attack suggested that the perpetrator knew when to strike. This raised questions about whether it could have been someone from the community who was familiar with the church's declining attendance. Investigators pursued multiple avenues, bringing in resources from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and behavioral analysts to develop a profile of the killer. They conducted hundreds of interviews, collected DNA samples from persons of interest, and followed up on tips from the public. Yet despite these extensive efforts, investigators have never publicly identified a suspect or made an arrest in the case. The impact of the murder extended far beyond the immediate investigation. The small community of Anadarko was profoundly affected. Local churches increased security measures. Some residents reported being afraid to attend services, particularly at smaller churches with limited attendance. The case received national media attention, placing Anadarko under an uncomfortable spotlight and raising questions about safety in small-town America. Carol's family, particularly her daughter Raina, has continued to advocate for justice. In interviews over the years, Raina has described her mother as a woman of tremendous faith and compassion. "My mother was called to minister," she said. "She believed in serving others and in the power of forgiveness. But there still needs to be justice." In 2010, partly in response to the Daniels case, Oklahoma Governor Brad Henry signed legislation known as Carol's Law. This law increased penalties for desecration of houses of worship and made it a felony to destroy evidence in murder cases. It was a small step toward ensuring that similar crimes would face enhanced penalties in the future, though it could do nothing to bring Carol's killer to justice. The Christ Holy Sanctified Church building where Carol Daniels was murdered stood empty for nearly 2 years after her death, a grim reminder of the violence that had occurred within its walls. In 2011, the building was finally demolished, removing a painful physical reminder for the community. However, the questions surrounding her death continue to haunt Anadarko and the investigators who have worked tirelessly to bring her killer to justice. The OSBI has stated that the case remains actively investigated. Over the years, advances in forensic technology have allowed investigators to re-examine evidence collected at the scene. DNA analysis, which continues to become more sophisticated, offers some hope that biological evidence preserved from the crime scene might eventually identify the killer, even if it was not initially detected due to the cleaning of the scene. As of 2023, more than 14 years after her murder, Carol Daniels' case remains officially unsolved. The reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction has been increased multiple times and now stands at $10,000. Jessica Brown of the OSBI has stated, "We believe someone knows something about this case. Even the smallest detail could be the key to solving it. We urge anyone with information, no matter how insignificant it might seem, to come forward." The case has been featured on various true crime programs and podcasts, keeping it in the public consciousness and potentially reaching someone who might have crucial information. Investigators hope that as time passes, relationships change, and consciences weigh heavy, someone with knowledge of the crime might finally come forward. Carol's daughter, Raina, continues to speak about her mother's case, hoping that publicity will eventually lead to a breakthrough. "My mother was a woman of faith who believed in forgiveness," Raina has said in interviews. "But there still needs to be justice. Someone took her from us in the most horrific way imaginable, and that person needs to be held accountable." For the residents of Anadarko, the unsolved murder remains an open wound. Many in the community still speak of before and after the Daniels murder, a crime so shocking that it altered the town's perception of itself and its sense of security. The knowledge that someone capable of such extraordinary violence might still be among them or in a neighboring community continues to unsettle many residents. The ritualistic nature of the crime has led some to wonder if the killer might have religious delusions or was making some twisted statement about faith. The positioning of Daniel's body in a crucifix pose, the setting of a church, and the victim being a pastor all suggest symbolism that investigators have tried to interpret. Was the killer expressing rage against religion, acting out some personal theology, or perhaps attempting to create a false impression of religious motivation to obscure their true intent? For investigators, the methodical cleaning of the crime scene remains one of the most troubling aspects of the case. This level of forensic awareness suggests someone who had either planned the murder carefully, researching how to avoid leaving evidence, or someone with professional knowledge of crime scene investigation. This could point to a killer with a higher level of education or experience than initially assumed. The location of Anadarko itself presents another layer of complexity. Situated in rural Oklahoma, the town is accessible via several highways, but is not directly on a major interstate. This has led some investigators to believe the killer was likely local or had strong ties to the area, rather than being someone passing through. However, the possibility of a transient killer who specifically targeted a small, isolated church cannot be ruled out. As time passes, the chances of solving the case through traditional investigative means diminish. Memories fade, witnesses pass away or move, and physical evidence degrades. However, modern forensic techniques, particularly in the realm of DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, offer new hope for cold cases like Carol Daniels. In recent years, genealogical DNA databases have helped solve dozens of cold cases across the country. If the killer left even trace amounts of DNA that were preserved despite the cleaning efforts, advances in technology might eventually identify them. Familial DNA searching, which looks for partial matches from relatives of unknown perpetrators, has proven particularly effective in cases where traditional DNA matching failed to produce results. For now, the murder of Pastor Carol Daniels remains one of Oklahoma's most disturbing unsolved cases. A brutal killing in a house of worship that continues to defy explanation and justice. Her family, the investigators assigned to her case, and the community of Anadarko continue to hope for answers, for closure, and for justice for a woman who dedicated her life to faith and service, only to have that life ended in an act of shocking violence. While separated by time, distance, and circumstance, the cases of Barbara Jean Horn and Carol Daniels share disturbing parallels that highlight the devastating impact of unsolved murders on families and communities. Both victims were killed in broad daylight in locations where they should have been safe. Barbara Jean near her home in a family neighborhood, and Carol in her own church. In both cases, the killers acted with a level of boldness that suggests either opportunity or careful planning. They struck in places where detection was possible, indicating either a willingness to take risks or confidence in their ability to avoid capture. Both bodies were manipulated after death. Barbara Jean stuffed into a box and discarded. Carol posed in a ritualistic manner. This post-mortem interaction reveals something disturbing about the killer's psychologies. In Barbara Jean's case, the disposal of her body in a box suggests a desire to conceal, transport, and distance the killer from their crime. In Carol's case, the careful positioning of her body indicates a desire to create a specific tableau or message, a signature that holds meaning for the killer but has eluded investigators. In both cases, justice has remained elusive for years, leaving families in perpetual limbo. The passage of time has only deepened the wounds for those left behind. Sharon Fahey, Barbara Jean's mother, endured not only the loss of her daughter but also the cruel twist of believing justice had been served, only to discover decades later that her daughter's killer remained free. Raina Daniels has spent over 14 years advocating for her mother's case, watching as leads grow cold and public attention wanes. The Horn case shows the tragic consequences when justice goes wrong. An innocent man imprisoned for decades while a killer goes free. Walter Ogrod's wrongful conviction demonstrates how pressure to solve high-profile cases, reliance on coerced confessions, and the testimony of unreliable jailhouse informants can lead to catastrophic mistakes. His case serves as a sobering reminder of the human cost of a flawed criminal justice system. The Daniels case reveals how even with modern forensic techniques, determined killers can still evade capture by methodically cleaning crime scenes and leaving minimal evidence behind. The killer's forensic awareness, using bleach to destroy potential DNA evidence, shows a level of planning and knowledge that has helped them avoid identification for over a decade. These cases also expose the ripple effects of murder beyond the immediate victim. Barbara Jean's mother spent decades believing justice had been served only to learn that her daughter's real killer was never caught. Walter Ogrod lost nearly 3 decades of his life for a crime he didn't commit. The community of Northeast Philadelphia lived with a false sense of security, believing a child killer had been removed from their midst when in reality he remained free. In Anadarko, an entire community lives with the knowledge that someone capable of extraordinary violence might still walk among them. Local churches increased security measures after Carol's murder. Residents reported being more vigilant, more suspicious. The demolition of the Christ Holy Sanctified Church building in 2011 was as much about removing a painful reminder as it was about moving forward, the physical structure too tainted by what had occurred within its walls. Perhaps most troubling is what these unsolved cases reveal about justice in America. Despite advanced forensics, dedicated investigators, and media attention, some killers simply escape punishment. Each passing year makes resolution less likely as memories fade, evidence deteriorates, and witnesses pass away or become less reliable. The cases highlight the limitations of our investigative capabilities and the imperfect nature of human memory. In Barbara Jean's case, eyewitness testimony about a man carrying a television box led to the composite sketch that would eventually be used to implicate Walter Ogrod, despite significant inconsistencies in witness descriptions. In Carol's case, the lack of witnesses altogether has hampered the investigation from the start. The racial and socioeconomic dimensions of these cases cannot be ignored. Barbara Jean Horn was a white child from a working-class neighborhood in Philadelphia. Her case received significant media attention, and there was immense pressure on police to solve it quickly. Carol Daniels was an African-American woman murdered in a predominantly white town with a complex racial history. While her case did receive media coverage, questions remain about whether racial biases influenced aspects of the investigation or the resources allocated to it. Yet there is always hope. Cold cases are solved every year as new technologies emerge, witnesses finally come forward, or perpetrators confess. The recent exoneration of Walter Ogrod shows that the pursuit of truth can eventually prevail, even after decades of injustice. Advances in DNA technology, particularly genetic genealogy, have revolutionized cold case investigations, leading to breakthroughs in cases that had been dormant for decades. Both cases remain officially open, with investigators still pursuing leads and re-examining evidence. For the families of Barbara Jean Horn and Carol Daniels, this continued effort provides a small measure of comfort. The knowledge that their loved ones have not been forgotten by the justice system, even if final resolution remains elusive. Before we part ways, I want to thank you for taking this journey through these haunting, unsolved cases with me. If you found value in this exploration of justice delayed and denied, please hit that subscribe button. Your support allows me to continue shining light on cases that might otherwise be forgotten. Together, we can keep the memory of victims like Barbara Jean Horn and Carol Daniels alive, and perhaps someday help bring their killers to justice. For Barbara Jean Horn and Carol Daniels, the search for answers continues. Their stories remind us that behind every unsolved case are real families waiting for closure. Mothers, fathers, daughters, and sons who deserve to know the truth about what happened to their loved ones. These cases are not just historical curiosities or true crime fodder. They are ongoing investigations where public awareness might still make the difference between justice served and justice denied. Someone somewhere knows what happened to these victims, and perhaps someday they will finally speak the truth. The passage of time has not diminished the horror of these crimes or the need for resolution. Barbara Jean Horn would now be approaching middle age, potentially with children or even grandchildren of her own, had her life not been cut tragically short. Carol Daniels would be in her 70s, perhaps retired from ministry, but still a guiding presence for her family and community. Their potential futures, all they might have experienced, contributed, and loved, were stolen not just from them but from all who knew them and all who would have benefited from their presence in the world. Justice delayed is often said to be justice denied. For Barbara Jean Horn and Carol Daniels, justice has been delayed for decades. But as long as their cases remain open, as long as investigators continue to pursue leads, and as long as their stories continue to be told, there remains the possibility that justice, however delayed, might finally be served. Until then, we hold space for them in our collective memory, acknowledging the lives they lived and the justice they still deserve.